Alright, this is how to effectively and easily adjust your Quattro trigger on your Hatsan 135, 125, whatever other model that uses this trigger. And I recommend taking it out of the stock. On brake barrels, if you adjust the trigger wrong, you can get a really nasty surprise that can destroy your rifle or possibly injure you when if the trigger is adjusted to a point where it's a hair trigger, it can catch when you go to break the barrel and cock it, and then the barrel can suddenly, without warning, flick up. It'll bend the barrel, possibly do other damage, and yes, it can also injure you. This is always a risk with springers. That's why anti-bear trap mechanisms exist, but the anti-bear trap on a brake barrel only prevents you pulling the trigger. If you've adjusted the trigger to the point where it's dangerous, the anti-bear trap is not going to save you. So it is imperative that you know what you're doing when you adjust your trigger. And the great thing about this trigger is when you take it out of the stock, you can actually see its inner workings. There's a little window here, and that actually shows the sear. My video quality is not great, but in a minute I'll show you how this works, and you can do this yourself very easily. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to explain to you how to get one of these. This is a Hatsan 135 in 30 cal. How to get these out of the stock without damaging things, because it's easy once you know it, but a lot of people have had problems. So it's this front screw, okay? Now, I damaged this one because I didn't know, so you can not have the same problem as me. You can learn from my mistake. I've since done this on another brand new, straight out of the box Hatsan 135 with absolutely no issues. So there were no problems with it. So the trick is to rotate the sling swivel clockwise until it gets tight. And what that does, if you look at this here, see there's this nut and then there's this locking screw in the center. Now when you rotate this clockwise, it loosens the tension on this screw. You need to then undo this screw, and then all you got to do is just rotate this and pull this whole thing out. You just need to use your fingers. Most times you don't even have to put a screwdriver on this nut here. It'll just stay in the stock. You just unwind this, and if you rotate it clockwise to tighten it first, tightening the sling swivel loosens the locking screw. If you do that, you should be able to get the locking screw undone easily. Use a flat screwdriver is my recommendation, one that is high quality and fits well. Very important. I have not found a Phillips that fits it properly. Other people may have better knowledge about what type of screwdriver they're actually using on that, but I haven't found one. So a flat will do fine. If you do it properly, you should not have to put very much pressure on it, and there should be no reason for you to damage the screw. If you do damage the screw, it's relatively easy to replace because it is a standard thread size. The only thing is that the head of the screw is serrated, but if you use a normal screw that isn't serrated, just use some Loctite on it, no problems. And you might be able to get yourself a screw that fits screwdrivers better, but wrecking the screw is not the end of the world. Screws are easy to get. So without that out of the way, what I want to show you next is the trigger. Now, when you pull this out of the stock, there's these pins. Now these pins here, the only thing that holds them in is the actual stock. They can fall out, so just be careful. It's not the end of the world if everything falls apart. You just have to put it back together. But It's a pain, and you shouldn't have to do that. If you just are gentle, pull it out carefully, and just keep an eye on these pins, because each one of these pieces of the trigger mechanism is held in by a pin that's just pushed in, and they all just slide out. You can pull them out with your fingers. Okay, so the next thing is there is 3 adjustment screws. So here you have an adjustment screw that controls this thing here. Now on the other end of this lever is the spring. That spring goes between it and the sear, and that is your trigger spring tension. That affects both stages. Then you have your first stage adjustment and your second stage adjustment. Now the important thing to understand is that both these screws are on the trigger blade, and they're both in front of this fulcrum point that the trigger rotates on, and they both contact the first sear. There are 3 sears in this trigger mechanism, and they both contact the first sear. This screw has more mechanical advantage than this one, more leverage. That's why the first stage is soft and the second stage comes up against a wall. It's because there's more leverage on this because it's closer to the fulcrum. Each of these 2 screws affects the adjustment of the other one, and if you adjust this wrong, you can get yourself into a bad situation. Now the safe way to do this, and the second reason why I recommend you take this out of the stock, is that you can actually cock this trigger without cocking the gun. And what you do is you get this small Allen wrench in here and up against the second sear. Hang on, I'll just do this. Up against the second sear. Hang on, I'll make sure you can see this. It's much harder for me to do this on camera. But what you see that? You just poke it through this hole here, right? And you catch it on the second sear, and you can cock the sear. So you can see those 2 little points in there. That's the first and second sear surface engaging with each other. That trigger is now cocked, but we haven't cocked the gun, so it's completely safe, and you can basically test the operation of that trigger completely safely. And what you'll see, you'll see it much easier when you do it yourself, is you pull this first stage, and you'll see that the engagement surface reduces down to almost nothing. So that first stage is actually taking up most of the sear engagement, and then the last little bit is your second stage. That's how you want to have it. So you want to take up most but not all of the sear engagement on the first stage. That's really one of the good things about a 2-stage trigger, is that it's safe because you've got lots of meat with these two sears touching each other, and the first stage you take it up to almost nothing, and then second stage, boom. That makes it a safe trigger. Now, the way I adjust this is I screw in the first stage adjustment a long way. Bear in mind, the first stage adjustment, if you adjust it far enough, you will have no second stage. And if you adjust it even further, you'll get to a point where you've got a hair trigger on your first stage. So, important to get this one right first. Just adjust your first stage so it's quite far in. I've got mine about maybe a millimeter below the surface of that trigger blade. That's how I've got mine, but your mileage may vary. And then what I've done is I've adjusted the second one so it's out quite a bit, and that to me has worked. But that's from me doing trial and error and just messing with this, using that cocking method. You just hook onto that second sear and just lever it that way, and it just clicks, and then you can just test out the operation of the trigger as much as you like until you get it behaving exactly the way you want it. Now, some guys take this screw out, because there's only so far you can wind this out and the spring tension doesn't decrease anymore. I don't recommend that. I think that because what happens is that the trigger blade touches, just here, the trigger blade will touch that, you see that moving a little bit? It'll touch this lever, and if you've got it all the way in, that comes more out here, and it'll touch the trigger blade more. And what will happen is if you've got low spring tension, you can push on it and it just feels really weird and mushy, because the end of travel, instead of hitting a hard wall, it gets all spongy because the trigger starts moving this thing. I just think it doesn't feel good. So what I recommend is taking the spring out and replacing it with a much softer spring. In my case, because I just used what I had on hand, I took the spring out of a ballpoint pen and I cut it down to a suitable length and I put that in there, and now that spring tension is very, very light. That affects the first and second stage. That's just how it is. But when you've adjusted it to a very light spring, then you can wind the tension of this in quite a bit, and that solves the problem of having that mushy end of travel, which I think is shit. So don't take the screw all the way out. There's a better way to do it. Just replace the spring. That's you will never get the trigger as light as you want it by not replacing that spring. It's a very hard spring. So just do it. It's easy peasy. All you do is take this pin out, and then this lever comes out. I can do it for you right now. There we go. Pull that out, and here we go. There's the lever there, and the spring just goes on that little nipple thing, and you shove the spring down into there, and away you go. Excuse the Monster energy drink, by the way. I don't have anything to hold my phone up, so I just placed it on top of a Monster energy can, and that should do it. Now, stuff it. I'll take the trigger blade out as well. It makes it easier. There we go. So there's the trigger blade. As you can see, there are the two ends of the screws, and yeah, that's how that works. Right, so we'll just push this back in, and there we go. And then, so it's actually a very easy trigger to work on. Now, I haven't polished this trigger yet, and I don't know that I will, because I don't know if I can be bothered. If you do what I suggest, you'll find that you'll have a very light, very crisp trigger as it is, and to go any better than that, you're really heading towards match trigger territory anyway, which you don't actually want on a powerful Magnum Springer. It's more of a hunting rifle to begin with. You want a heavier trigger, not heavy, but you want a trigger that's, you know, above 1 pound, I would say. You want to be able to feel something on that second stage. Otherwise you can get yourself into some problems. I've got an Air Arms Pro Sport, and I adjusted the trigger. All I did was move one of the screws by about maybe a 1/16 of a turn, if that, maybe less. And it went from having a quite crisp second stage, that you could, a very easily definable second stage where you could pull it back and you could rest your finger on that second stage while you're getting your crosshairs right on target, and it went from that to unexpectedly going off when you're trying to rest on that second stage. The second stage was so light that you couldn't feel it. Now, guys that shoot in competitions might like that. They like triggers that are super light, But if you're shooting offhand, you don't want that. Yeah. So guys do polish it. I'm not saying don't. I'm just saying I haven't, and I don't really see the need for it right now. But that's how you do it. I'll just demonstrate the little trick now. Then this, trust me, nobody else on the internet has done this that I'm aware of or shown this. You just insert the little wrench in here and then pull that way. Click. There you get to see the sear engagement, and the way I've got it set, there's maybe just over 1 millimeter of engagement, and then it goes down to almost nothing when you pull back to the second stage, and then just light increase in pressure and off it goes. And I can adjust this a little bit. Now, adjusting that in actually makes this is the thing that people misunderstand, and reading the manual will mislead you even further with this. This screw going in does not decrease your second stage, the length of travel on your second stage. And what actually happens is if you wind this out, then the trigger can travel further on the first stage, leaving less for your second stage. So if I wind it out a little bit more, eventually there's almost nothing there. I'll wind it out a little bit more, and bear in mind this has not affected the sear engagement the whole time, because this screw right now is not touching the sear. But when you pull this back, see, it's still got plenty of sear engagement on that second stage. So I believe we've gone all the way that we can adjust it. That's the other thing, that eventually you can't adjust it any further. So when you reach the end of adjustment on this, it stops going out. It starts just hitting the back of the trigger blade instead, and is not contacting the screw anymore. So then what you can do, if you want to shorten the second stage further, is you wind the first stage one in. Now bear in mind, I've got it set so winding this in will actually shorten the sear engagement when you're not touching the trigger. There we go. So that's still a quite tolerable trigger, but I reckon I can lighten this further. I'll just wind this in another tiny fraction of a turn. Yeah, so that's a lighter and shorter second stage, but the thing is, starting to shorten the sear engagement to the point where yeah, I wouldn't want to go any further than that because of safety. But the good thing about being able to look through this window and see your sear engagement is that you can be safe. You can test it out, you can mess with it, you can decide for yourself how much sear engagement you want here. And you can just keep messing around with it without having to ever cock the rifle and get it to the point where it does what you want it to do. Yeah. Bear in mind, of course, that while the gas ram isn't on that last sear, which is in here, while there isn't the pressure of that gas ram, this trigger is going to be lighter than what it will be finally. But the reason why they have 3 sears in here, 3 sear surface engagement points, is to stop the power of this gas ram, all of that tension being interacting directly with your trigger blade. So you can actually have a light trigger like you would have on a firearm on something that's holding that much energy back on the sear. which back when I only shot cheap, nasty air rifles, I didn't think was possible. It was only once I got more into the game that I realised you can have a proper match trigger on an air rifle. Not that this is. This is not a match trigger by any stretch of the imagination. Hatsans, we love them, but sloppy tolerances, they are diamonds in the rough, and yeah, there's a lot you can do to them to make them better, but they're affordable, they're solid, they're built like tanks, like something that's come out of the Soviet Union. Not really much else on the market quite like them, but they're not a match trigger by any stretch of the imagination. That's not a precision trigger, but it is a good trigger that you can do quite a lot to. And there's no plastic in that trigger either. There's no plastic in any part of this action apart from a shock absorber on the front stock mount, and obviously your seals and stuff like that, which is to be expected, and the safety. The safety also is plastic, but that is not an issue. But other than that, this is all steel and is rock solid. So do yourself a favor, if you like tinkering, pick one of these things up and mess with it. You'll be surprised what you can achieve with it, and let me tell you, there are no other brake barrel springers on the market that match the power of these things. So yeah, have fun.